The signal arrived on a Tuesday. It came in at 4:47 in the morning, picked up first by a deep space listening station on the dark side of the moon. The automated system flagged it immediately. It was not like any signal that had been received before. It was structured and clearly intelligent, packed with layered information, and it was addressed in rough but recognizable English, Mandarin, Spanish, and 9 other languages directly to the people of Earth. By 6 in the morning, the signal had been routed to 3 separate government facilities on 2 continents. By 8, it had reached Dr. Carol Finney at the National Xenolinguistics Institute in Maryland. Carol was 53 years old, had spent her entire career preparing for exactly this kind of moment, and when the encrypted file landed in her inbox, she felt her hands go still on her keyboard for just a second before she opened it. She read it once. Then she picked up the secure line on her desk and called Colonel Aaron Cole at the United Earth Defense Command. "You need to see this," she said, "right now." Aaron Cole was a careful man. He had spent 20 years in the military and another 10 inside the command structure of the United Earth Defense Program, a branch of government that officially did not exist in any public document, and which had been quietly building, funding, and preparing Earth's interstellar military capability for the better part of 3 decades. He was not easily surprised. But when Carol read him the key sections of the transmission over the phone, he sat forward in his chair and did not say anything for a long moment. "Get it verified," he said finally. "All 3 independent stations. I want confirmation by noon." Confirmation came at 11:42. By 2 in the afternoon, the file was on the desk of Admiral Grace Donovan. Grace was 60 years old, with short gray hair, and the kind of calm that is not born, but built. Built out of years of hard decisions and the discipline to live with them. She commanded Earth's combined interstellar fleet from a facility buried deep beneath the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. A place so far off the public record that even most senior military personnel didn't know it existed. She had spent her career preparing for a war she wasn't sure would ever come. Now she read a transmission that told her the war had already been going on for 62 years, and that the people fighting it were losing badly, and that they were asking Earth for help. She read the full transmission twice. Then she set it flat on the desk and looked at her aide, Lieutenant Sam Garrett, who had brought it to her. "Get every fleet commander on a secure line," she said. "Tonight. No delays. No excuses. Everyone." Sam Garrett, who had worked for Grace Donovan for 6 years, and had learned to move quickly when she used that tone, had the calls arranged within 4 hours. The meeting that night lasted 11 hours. It was held in the main operations room of the underground facility, with 16 fleet commanders joining by secure link from stations across the solar system and beyond. Commander Ray Vance, who led the Rapid Stellar Response Division and was arguably the most aggressive tactical mind in Earth's military, attended in person. He arrived early, which was unusual for him, and sat near the front with his arms crossed and his eyes alert. Dr. Nina Larson was also there. Nina was Earth's leading strategic analyst, not a soldier, but the kind of mind that soldiers listen to because she was almost always right. She had spent 15 years studying conflict theory, alien behavioral patterns, and the structural weaknesses of hierarchical military systems. When the transmission had been forwarded to her department that afternoon, she had locked herself in her office for 4 hours and come out with 12 pages of handwritten notes. What emerged from those 11 hours was not a debate about whether to respond. That question was settled in the first 20 minutes. Every person in that room, soldiers and scientists alike, understood what was being asked and understood what it meant. The question was, how? Nina Larson stood up near the end of the 3rd hour and said what many people in the room had already been thinking, but hadn't said out loud yet. The Vreth have been fighting species that process conflict the way most intelligent beings do, with caution, with self-preservation at the center, with the goal of winning while losing as little as possible. She paused. Humans do not always fight that way, and that is not a weakness. That is the single biggest advantage we have walking into this. She pulled up a tactical map of the conflict zone on the main screen. The coalition's losses were marked in red. There was a great deal of red. They have been predictable, she said, tracing the pattern of the coalition's movements. They respond the way the Vreth expect them to respond. We are not going to do that. The planning that followed was intense, detailed, and at times very loud. There were arguments about resource allocation, about fleet deployment strategy, about the level of force that was appropriate for a first-contact military engagement with an alien power. Ray Vance and Aaron Cole disagreed sharply at one point about the size of the forward strike group. Grace Donovan let them argue for exactly 4 minutes, then cut them both off and made the decision herself. By the time the meeting ended and the sun was coming up over the mountains, the plan was in place. It was not a complicated plan. It was, in fact, built on a principle so simple that it could have been written on the back of a napkin. Hit them from every direction at once, faster than they can think, harder than they expect, and do not stop until it is over. Earth had been building the tools for this kind of plan for 30 years. Ships that were dense and heavily armored, and built to take punishment that would crack lighter vessels apart. Weapons systems that had been developed in isolation from any external influence, which meant they had been built purely to be effective, rather than to match any known standard. Soldiers who had trained not just for conventional battle, but for every kind of chaos that could be imagined, because human military culture had always understood, deep in its bones, that war never goes exactly the way you plan it. Within 72 hours of the meeting, the first wave of the United Earth Expeditionary Fleet had broken orbit. Ship after ship after ship, rising through the dark in tight formation, moving with a quiet and purposeful speed. No civilian news station reported it. No public announcement was made. The streets of every city on Earth went on as normal. Morning traffic, coffee shops opening, children going to school. Only a few thousand people on the entire planet knew what was moving through space above their heads, and not one of them doubted that it was ready. The planet Selur Prime was dying, not in a slow, natural way. It was dying the way things die in war, fast and loud and full of fire. The Vreth Forward Battle Group had been in position above it for 11 days, and in that time, they had reduced 2 of the planet's major population centers to rubble. The coalition defense line that had been holding the orbital perimeter was breaking apart piece by piece. Ships were burning. Signals were being cut. The commanders on the coalition side were no longer sending strategic reports. They were sending desperate ones. Fleet Commander Zeth Kara watched it all from the bridge of his command vessel, with the calm satisfaction of a being who had done this many times before and expected to do it many times again. He was a tall figure with 6 eyes arranged in 2 rows, a long angular jaw, and a history of victory that had made him one of the most feared military commanders in Vreth space. He had never retreated in 40 years of service. He had never needed to. The battle above Selur Prime was already decided in his mind. It was simply a matter of finishing it. His tactical officer reported that the last coalition defense cluster was down to 30% capacity. The main station in the upper orbit was venting atmosphere. The evacuation ships had already been destroyed. Zeth Kara gave the order to advance the secondary fleet and begin the planetary bombardment sequence. It was routine, clean, efficient. Then the long-range scanner officer made a sound that Zeth Kara had not heard from a subordinate in a very long time. It was the sound of genuine confusion. "Commander," the officer said slowly, "I am reading new contacts, incoming, from the outer system." Zeth Kara walked to the scanner station and looked at the display himself. The contacts were real. A large number of them, more than 100 vessels moving in close formation from the direction of the outer belt. They did not match any ship design in his tactical database. They were dense and heavy and shaped differently from coalition ships, which tended to be long and narrow. These were built more like fists. "Identify them," he said. The identification process took longer than it should have. His system cycled through every known coalition configuration and came back empty. Then it ran a wider search through the general galactic ship registry and returned a match. But a strange one. The ships were registered to a species called humans, from a planet called Earth. The file attached to the entry was thin. The species was rated as pre-interstellar conflict level. The threat assessment at the bottom of the file was a single word: minimal. Zethkara stared at that word for a moment. It was a signal the Vreth had used for decades. A powerful, clear broadcast that essentially said, "You are in a combat zone controlled by the Vreth Dominion. Identify your allegiance or be destroyed." Every coalition species responded to it with either surrender or panicked retreat. It was reliable. What came back from the human fleet was not a surrender. It was not a retreat. It was an audio file. His translation system identified it as music, a human cultural artifact called Highway to Hell, originating from Earth, recorded several centuries ago by a group of humans who apparently made very loud sounds together as a form of expression. His tactical officers looked at each other. Nobody said anything. Zethkara listened to approximately 12 seconds of it and then closed the channel. On the bridge of the command vessel CNS Ironclad, Admiral Grace Donovan watched the Vreth fleet's response on her tactical screen and said nothing for a moment. Then she turned to her communications officer and opened a channel, not to the Vreth, but to what was left of the coalition forces holding the line above Salur Prime. "This is Admiral Grace Donovan of the United Earth Expeditionary Fleet," she said, in the calm, even tone she used for all official communications, whether she was ordering lunch or entering a war zone. "We have reviewed the tactical situation. Pull your forces back 200,000 kilometers and hold position. Do not engage. We will take it from here." On the bridge of the coalition command ship, Admiral Ryun of the Saloon, old, exhausted, running on stubbornness and the memory of what he was fighting for, received the transmission and looked at his crew. His ship was damaged. His fleet was at a fraction of its strength. His people had been fighting this enemy for longer than some of his crew members had been alive. He had nothing left to lose by trusting the humans. "All ships," he said quietly, "fall back. Hold at 200,000. The coalition fleet pulled away from the battle line, and for a moment, the space between them and the Vreth went still. Zethkara watched the coalition retreat on his scanner and felt something that he did not normally feel, a faint, unnameable unease. The coalition had never pulled back voluntarily before. They always held until they broke. Something was different about this. Something in the pattern did not match his models. He looked at the human fleet, sitting in the outer edge of scanner range, and tried to read their formation. He couldn't. The arrangement of their ships did not correspond to any offensive or defensive pattern he recognized. They were not in a standard attack wedge. They were in something he had no name for. He told himself it did not matter. They were a minor species, a primitive one. His database said minimal threat. He had faced down the best the coalition had to offer for 4 decades and never flinched. He gave the order to continue the bombardment sequence on Salur Prime. What happened next would later be described by the handful of Vreth officers who survived and were willing to talk about it as the moment when they understood, far too late, that they had made a very serious mistake. The human fleet began to move, not slowly, not cautiously. It moved the way something moves when it has been sitting still for a very long time, and has finally been given permission to go, with a sudden, total and overwhelming commitment that left no room for doubt about its intentions. Seth Kara watched them come and felt the unease sharpen into something harder and colder. He opened his tactical system and began running responses. His models spun up, calculating, projecting, looking for the pattern he could use to predict them. His models ran for 4 seconds and then returned an error. Not a partial result, not a low-confidence projection, an error. No matching pattern found. Seth Kara had been fighting wars for 40 years. He had never seen his tactical system return an error. He started to give a new order, but the humans were already moving faster than the order could catch up to. The battle above Selur Prime had begun. It started on 7 fronts at the same time. That was the first thing that broke Seth Kara's models. Every enemy he had ever fought opened an engagement from 1 or 2 directions. It was the logical approach. Concentrate your force, apply pressure at a weak point, exploit the breach. Clean, rational, predictable. The Vreth had spent 40 years learning how to counter it. The humans came from 7 directions simultaneously. Not 7 groups attacking the same point from different angles. 7 completely separate and independent assault columns, each targeting a different section of the Vreth formation, each moving at a different speed, each using a different tactical pattern. It was not a single attack. It was 7 different attacks happening at the same moment, and each one demanded a full response. The Vreth formation did what it was trained to do. It tried to respond to all 7, and that was exactly what the humans had planned for. On the ground level of the engagement, Colonel Aaron Cole was running the Armored Strike Division from the bridge of the heavy cruiser CNS Aldridge. His section of the assault was aimed directly at the center of the Vreth formation, the part that looked strongest and therefore was the part no sane attacker would target first. Aaron had specifically chosen it because of that logic. If the Vreth expected anything, they expected to be attacked at the edges. So he went straight through the middle. His ships moved in a rotating wedge pattern, a formation that the Coalition had never used and the Vreth had never modeled. The rotation was the key. As the front ships drew fire, the formation would shift so that the next group came through from a slightly different angle, meaning the Vreth gun crews had to constantly recalculate their targeting. It was disorienting in a way that required sustained mental adjustment, and it denied the Vreth something they relied on deeply: the ability to establish a steady rhythm in a firefight. The Vreth center formation broke in 40 minutes. It didn't retreat. It fragmented, splitting into smaller clusters that lost contact with each other in the chaos. Isolated, each cluster tried to fight independently, but without coordination, they were ineffective. Aaron's division moved through the gaps and began cutting the larger fleet into pieces. Meanwhile, on the far side of the engagement, Sergeant Dana Pruitt was doing something that the Vreth had not encountered in all their decades of war. She was inside their ships. Dana led a 12-person infiltration unit that specialized in close-quarters boarding operations, a combat style that most species in the galaxy had long considered obsolete because ship-to-ship docking in an active battle zone was considered suicidal. Humans, apparently, had a different view on what counted as suicidal. Her team breached the hull of the first Vreth command ship using a magnetic cutting tool that worked in under 4 minutes. Once inside, they moved through the corridors with a speed and certainty that came from hundreds of hours of training in dark, tight spaces, because human special operations training was, among other things, very good at preparing soldiers for exactly the kind of environments that were worst for everybody's nerves. The first command ship lost all communications and weapons control within 22 minutes of the breach. By the time the Vreth crews realized what was happening, Dana's team was already cutting into the second one. 3 command ships, all 3 disabled from the inside. The Vreth fleet lost the ability to coordinate its flanking response before that response had even been fully formed. Commander Ray Vance's Rapid Response Wing was handling of Vreth interceptors, the fastest ships in the enemy fleet, the ones that were supposed to cut off any flanking maneuvers and protect the main body from fast attack runs. The Vreth interceptors were genuinely fast. By most galactic standards, they were the fastest military vessels in known space. But Ray Vance had built his wing around one specific insight that Nina Larson had flagged in her analysis. The Vreth interceptors were fast in straight lines. Turns cost them. Their engine configuration was built for speed in a single vector, and changing direction sharply came with a delay. Small, but measurable. Ray's ships were slightly slower in a straight line, but they were maneuverable in a way that the Vreth interceptors could not match, and his pilots had been training for high-stress, high-gravity combat turns for years. The human pilots also had a biological advantage that nobody in the Coalition had thought to mention in their intelligence briefing. Humans could tolerate G-force stress at levels that would incapacitate most other species. Turns that should have been physically impossible for a living crew were simply uncomfortable for Ray's people. They pushed through them, executed them cleanly, and came out on the other side of each maneuver still functional and still fighting. The Vreth interceptor wing was neutralized in 1 hour and 17 minutes. Back on the ironclad, Dr. Nina Larson stood at the tactical display and watched the whole shape of the battle developing in real time. She did not carry a weapon, and she had never been in a firefight, but she understood conflict at a structural level. And what she was watching was a very clear confirmation of everything she had theorized. "They keep trying to predict us," she said to Lieutenant Sam Garrett, who was standing next to her with a cup of cold coffee that he kept forgetting to drink. "Every time they form a response, we have already moved somewhere they didn't expect. They are fighting the version of us that their models built, and that version doesn't exist." Sam looked at the screen and nodded slowly. "So what do they do when the models stop working?" "They hesitate," she said, "and in a battle, hesitation is the end." She was right. Zeth Kara attempted 3 separate regrouping maneuvers over the course of the engagement. Each time, he pulled back a section of his fleet to a fallback position, intending to reform and push again from a stronger angle. Each time, human vessels were already at the fallback position before his ships arrived. Not waiting in ambush, simply there, having anticipated the move and arrived first. He did not understand how they were reading him so clearly. He would never get the chance to understand it, because understanding it required time, and time was the one thing he did not have. In the 4th hour, he tried his last option. He ordered his reserve fleet, the ships he had been holding back in case the battle turned, to make an emergency jump to a secondary position 3 light minutes away, where they could regroup and return with a fresh approach. They jumped. They arrived at the secondary position. The humans were already there. Not many of them. A small blocking force, positioned with quiet precision, waiting in the dark. But enough to prevent the regrouping. Enough to make clear that this escape route had been closed before the door was ever opened. Zeth Kara stood on his bridge and looked at the tactical display, and for the first time in 40 years of war, had nothing left in his models to reach for. At 4 hours and 51 minutes from the start of the engagement, he transmitted a formal cessation signal. The channel opened. Grace Donovan's voice came through, calm and clear. "We receive your cessation signal. Stand down all weapons. Power down engines to 10%. This engagement is over." And it was. 62 years of war ended in 4 hours and 51 minutes. The stars above Salur Prime, which had been burning and flashing with weapons fire since the battle began, went quiet. And somewhere in the broken Coalition fleet, a very old and very tired admiral named Ryun put his head down on his console and did not move for a long time. Silence is a strange thing after a very long war. It does not feel like peace at first. It feels like a trick. Soldiers who have spent years in the middle of noise and fire and constant danger do not know how to trust quiet. They keep looking at their scanners. They keep their hands near their controls. They wait for the next alarm, because the next alarm has always come for as long as they can remember. The coalition forces that had pulled back to hold position above Salur Prime sat in their damaged ships and looked at their screens and watched the Vreth fleet going dark, one ship at a time, weapons powering down, engines slowing, the lights of a war machine going out like candles at the end of a long night. And they did not know how to respond to what they were seeing. A young navigator aboard one of the surviving coalition cruisers, barely 20 years old, and the only member of her crew who had not been alive when the war started, looked at the blackened space where the battle had been, and then looked at the timestamp on her screen. 4 hours and 51 minutes. She had been in the military for 2 years. In 2 years, the coalition had lost 4 more systems and 3,000 more ships. In 4 hours and 51 minutes, the humans had ended it. She did not cry. She just sat very still for a while and tried to understand what she was feeling, and could not find a name for it. Admiral Ryun, who had been fighting this war since before most of his crew were born, eventually raised his head from his console. His communications officer was looking at him, waiting for orders. There were things to do, damage reports to file, survivor counts to take, medical teams to deploy, a planet below that still needed help. The work of the aftermath was already beginning. But before any of that, he sent a message. It went to Admiral Grace Donovan, on the bridge of the CNS Ironclad, still in her command chair, still watching the tactical display, as her officers confirmed the last of the Vreth surrender signals. The message from Ryun was short. It had taken him a long time to write it, not because the words were complicated, but because they were the hardest kind of words, the kind you have to mean completely, with no room for pride or qualification. It said, "We should have called you sooner." Grace read it once. She looked at it for a moment in the way she looked at things when she was deciding how much to say. Then she typed back 4 words and sent it. "You called when needed." She set down her tablet, looked up at the tactical screen, and then told her communications officer to open a channel to all fleet commanders. She gave a brief address, no dramatic language, no long speech. She confirmed that the engagement was over, gave instructions for the next phase of operations, and reminded her commanders that they still had a job to do. Then she closed the channel and asked someone to bring her a cup of coffee. Commander Ray Vance, whose rapid response wing had burned through more fuel in 5 hours than they had in the previous year of training exercises, leaned back in his command chair and let out a long breath. He had not slept in 31 hours. He had a cut on his left hand from where he had grabbed the edge of a console during a particularly sharp evasive maneuver, and he had not noticed it until the battle was over. He looked at it now with mild interest, decided it was not serious, and began writing his post-engagement report. Colonel Aaron Call was already on a secure channel with Grace Donovan's staff, beginning the planning for what came next, securing the Vreth fleet, establishing communication with the remaining Vreth leadership, and figuring out what a formal end to a 62-year war actually looked like on paper. Sergeant Dana Pruitt, whose team had come back from the 3rd Vreth command ship with 2 minor injuries and 1 borrowed Vreth energy drink that she described as tasting like cold metal and regret, was in the medical bay of her transport ship, getting her team's injuries looked at. She was handed a preliminary commendation notice and used it to hold her place in the book she had been reading between missions. Dr. Nina Larson sat in the quiet of the tactical room on the Ironclad and wrote for 4 hours without stopping. She wrote down everything she had observed, everything she had theorized, and everything she now believed with complete certainty, to be true about why the engagement had ended the way it did. She titled the document with a simple question: why did humanity win in 5 hours when no one else could win in 62 years? Her answer, written across 31 pages of clean and careful analysis, could be reduced to a single central idea. Humans did not fight to survive. They fought to finish. For most species in the galaxy, the deep biological goal in any conflict was to preserve life, your own life, your crew's lives, the life of your civilization. This was rational. This was intelligent. This was also, in a war against an enemy like the Vreth, a weakness. Humans carried that same drive. They were not reckless with life, and they were not indifferent to loss. But they also carried something alongside it, something older and harder that had been shaped by thousands of years of their own history. The understanding that sometimes the only way to protect life was to commit to ending the fight completely and as fast as possible, with everything you had, regardless of how frightening that felt. The Vreth had been fighting species that wanted to stop the war. The humans had come to end it. Nina published the paper 6 weeks later. It was translated into 47 galactic languages. It was taught at the Coalition Military Academy within a year. Coalition scholars debated it for decades, and most of them agreed that it was correct. In the weeks that followed the battle, the Galactic Coalition held its first full session since the emergency summit at Kareth 4. The agenda had one primary item: the formal invitation of Earth into full coalition membership, not as an observed species, not as a junior partner, as a full member, with all the rights and responsibilities that came with it, and a permanent seat on the senior council. The vote was unanimous. It was noted in the official record as the first unanimous vote in coalition history. Ambassador Lyra Voss, who had proposed reaching out to humanity in the first place, signed her name at the bottom of the membership document, and did not speak for several minutes after she did so. Aaron Cole became Earth's first military liaison to the Coalition Joint Defense Committee. He was good at the job. He was patient, clear, and deeply serious, and the Coalition commanders respected him quickly. Dana Pruitt received the Coalition's highest civilian honor at a formal ceremony attended by 6 ambassadors and 2 Coalition fleet admirals. She accepted it graciously, shook every hand offered to her, and was photographed with the medal around her neck. Back in her quarters that night, she put the medal on the small shelf above her bunk, next to a photograph of her family, a worn paperback novel, and a coffee mug. Several weeks later, someone noticed her using the medal as a coaster. It became, within a short time, one of the most retold stories in Earth's military culture. Dana herself never commented on it. She just kept using the coaster. Ray Vance put in for extended leave the day after the formal coalition ceremony, and went home to Earth. He drove himself from the airfield to a small cabin in Montana, set his communication device on the shelf by the door, and went fishing. He did not speak to anyone from the military for 2 months. When he came back, he was unhelpful about whether the leave had helped him think, and whether he would take another one, and what he had caught, and whether he recommended the area. He just said it was quiet and went back to work. Carol Finney, who had decoded the Coalition's signal on that quiet Tuesday morning, wrote her own paper, shorter than Nina's, more personal in tone. She wrote about the moment she had first read the transmission and understood what it meant. She wrote about what it felt like to know that the galaxy was bigger and older and more full of suffering than her field of study had ever quite prepared her for. And she wrote about what it meant, to her, that the first thing the humans had done with that knowledge was help. Back on Earth on the day the fleet came home, the sun rose the same as it always did. Shops opened, trains ran, children went to school. The news was talking about things that had nothing to do with interstellar war, because no one had told them yet. The press release was still being written. The government communications team had been working on it for 3 weeks, and still could not agree on how to begin. Several drafts had been circulated. The shortest one opened with the words, "As you may not have known, we had a fleet." It was not approved, but several of the people in the room agreed it was the most honest version. Somewhere above them all, on a station in orbit around a recovering planet called Salur Prime, a very old and very tired coalition admiral named Ryun sat and watched the stars and thought about 62 years and 4 hours and 51 minutes, and the strange quiet that had replaced a war he had spent most of his life inside. He was not sure what to do with silence yet. The stars above Kareth 4 had always been beautiful. On any other night, the alien delegates who stood inside the great glass dome of the orbital station would have taken a moment to admire them. But on this night, nobody looked at the stars. Everyone in that room was too tired, too scared, and too broken to care about beauty. The war had been going on for 62 years. 62 years of fighting. 62 years of losing planets, losing people, and losing hope. The enemy was called the Vreth Dominion. They were not simply an army. They were a force of destruction that moved across the galaxy the way a storm moves across an open field. Slow enough that you could see it coming, and fast enough that you could not escape it. The Vreth did not negotiate. They did not offer peace. They did not take prisoners unless those prisoners could be used for something. They simply arrived, and they consumed everything in their path. Planets that had been home to millions of living beings were left silent and cold after the Vreth passed through. Entire species had been wiped from the galactic record. Their cities, their art, their languages, gone. The Galactic Coalition had been formed to stop this. 17 species had come together under one banner, pooled their armies, shared their technology, and promised each other that they would hold the line. In the early years, they believed they could win. They had numbers, they had determination, they had brilliant commanders and powerful warships, and the kind of hope that only comes when a cause feels righteous. But the Vreth were better at war. That was the simple, terrible truth that no coalition general wanted to say out loud. They were faster. They were more disciplined. Their commanders did not make emotional decisions. They calculated everything, every move, every countermove, every possible response, and they executed their plans with a cold and mechanical precision that the coalition forces could never quite match. Every time the coalition thought they had found an advantage, the Vreth adapted. Every time a new strategy was tried, the Vreth found a way to break it. It was like fighting an enemy that could read the future. By the time the emergency summit was called at Kareth 4, the coalition had lost 11 of its 30 inhabited systems. 3 species represented in that chamber had lost their home planets entirely. Their people now lived on refugee ships and temporary colonies, carrying the memories of worlds they would never see again. Ambassador Lyra Voss of the Saloon species stood at the center of the circular chamber. She was tall and pale, with wide, dark eyes, and a voice that was always quiet, not because she was soft, but because she had learned long ago that quiet voices made people listen harder. She had been in this war since the beginning. She had buried friends, colleagues, and 2 of her own children in its long shadow. She looked around the room at the faces of the other ambassadors. She saw exhaustion. She saw grief. She saw the particular look that people get when they have been strong for too long and are finally running out of strength. She opened her prepared statement, looked at it for a moment, and then set it aside. "I am not going to read a report tonight," she said. "You have all read the reports. You know what the numbers say. You know how much we have lost, and you know how much we are going to lose if nothing changes." The room was silent. "I want to talk about the humans," she said. The silence changed. It became a different kind of quiet. the kind that carries discomfort inside it. The humans. Everyone in that room knew about the humans. The small species from the unremarkable blue planet in a quiet corner of the galaxy. They had been discovered about 40 years ago during a routine deep space survey mission conducted by a Selouan exploration vessel. The surveyors had picked up radio signals, then light pollution from cities, then the unmistakable signs of a young civilization just beginning to reach toward space. Protocol required that such species be logged, catalogued, and placed under observation. The Coalition had strict rules about interfering with developing civilizations, so the humans had been watched from a distance, the way you might watch a new and unusual animal in the wild, with curiosity, with some caution, and with the quiet assumption that they were not yet ready for the larger world. What the Coalition observers had noted in their reports was a long list of concerning qualities. Humans were aggressive. They had fought wars among themselves for their entire recorded history. They had nearly destroyed their own planet more than once. They were loud, emotional, stubborn, and seemed to have a deep cultural attachment to conflict that most of the older species in the Coalition had long since moved past. What the Coalition observers had not fully understood was that these same qualities, the aggression, the stubbornness, the refusal to give up, the long and obsessive history of making war, had also made the humans extraordinarily good at it. "We have been watching them for 40 years, Lyra Voss said. "And in that time, they have not stopped building. They have not stopped training. They have developed weapons and ships and strategies that our analysts do not fully understand yet. They did not build these things because they knew about the Vreth. They built them because building for war is simply part of who they are." She paused and let that sit in the air. "I am proposing that we contact them. I am proposing that we tell them what is happening. And I am proposing that we ask for their help." The reaction was immediate. Voices rose around the chamber. An ambassador from the Theron Collective said it was irresponsible to bring such a young and volatile species into a galactic conflict. A representative from the Moon Assembly pointed out that humans had no experience with interstellar warfare. Several delegates reminded Lyra that the non-interference protocol existed for very good reasons. She let them speak. She simply waited until the noise faded, and then she said, "The Vreth will reach Selur Prime within 4 months. After that, they will move toward the inner systems. We have modeled it. We have run every scenario we have, and in every single one, we lose." Another silence, heavier this time. "We have tried everything we know how to do," she said. "We have tried it for 62 years, so I am suggesting that we try something we do not know how to do. I am suggesting that we call the humans, and we tell them the truth, and we see what they say." The vote that followed was not clean. It was argued over, delayed, and renegotiated, but in the end, it passed. The distress signal was composed that night. It was translated into every known human language. It explained the war, the enemy, and the situation, without softening any of the details. It simply told the truth, and then it waited to see what the humans would do with it. The signal was sent out through the Deep Space Relay Network at precisely 3 hours past midnight, Karath Standard Time. And then the galaxy held its breath. Nobody in that chamber truly knew what was coming. They had read the reports, they had seen the numbers, but numbers and reports could not fully explain what had been quietly growing in that small, noisy corner of the galaxy for the last 40 years.